Well, let's start out with just some basics. Tell me your name and when and where you were born.
It's that's probably the most complicated question of all. Actually, I was born in Poland, and when I came here, I came by way of a number of different countries, and whatever different country I was in, my name changed. And so when I came to a school here, by that time I was 11 years old, and my teacher asked me what my name was, and my last name was Marco Paco Jose Fight RISS, and the class burst out laughing. And so she said, well, from now on we'll call you Murray. So my name became Murray RISS. I was born in Poland in 1940. I was born as the World War II broke out, and my family lived in the southern part of Poland, and the Germans were coming from the east, and the Russians were coming from the west. Or, I'm sorry, it's the other way around. And the Germans were shipping all the prisoners to concentration camps. And my father was an advisor for one of the Polish governments, and they told him that if we're captured by the Germans, we probably won't survive, and we would do better to be captured by the Russians. So he convinced my mother's family, my grandfather, grandmother, and we packed up everything we could carry in a little suitcase and walked to the Russian border and were taken prisoners and sent to Siberia for 4 years. I have memories of us fleeing Poland, and I have images, specific images, and I've described those images to my parents, and they thought that someone must have told them because they happened when I was 9 months old. And then my next set of images start coming in when I'm about 3 years old, where I'm hungry and cold all the time. So that kind of made sense. And then we were there just before the war ended, and they let us go, and we were on our way to out of Russia, and we were taken prisoners by the Germans and sent to Germany, and then the war ended, luckily for us. So we were in Germany I was in Germany for about a year. I turned 7 in Germany, and my brother was born, and then everybody wanted to get out of Europe. And there was a large family. My grandfather and grandmother and 7 uncles and aunts and various cousins. And so it was hard to get into any countries. My father had a distant cousin in Ecuador, South America. So my mother, my father, and my brother, who was then just an infant, and I made our way to South America. We had to go to France first, and we spent a year there, so I learned French. And then by way of France, we had to go to Italy. That was the route, and so we spent several months in Italy, and I'd never learned Italian. And then we made it to Ecuador, and I was there for 3 years, and so by that time I was fluent in Spanish. And in 1951, when I was 11 years old, on September 11th, 1951, we made it into the United States. I remember that we didn't have any money, and we were immigrants, and we found this place where we slept on tables, and we had to pack up I think it was a restaurant, where we slept on tables, and we had to pack up everything we had before they opened the doors, and we would stay there. We could if we wanted to, but we would leave and come back in the evening and sleep there again. We landed in Miami, and then we took a Greyhound into Brooklyn, New York, and so I got to see the whole southeast part of the country, and that was pretty magnificent. And one of the first stops, the images I remember are how beautiful the countryside was. I kept seeing ocean, and that still stays with me. And the other one was that we got off the bus for rest stops, and so I saw a man go up to a Coke machine and put a dime in and get a Coke, and then he looked in for the change, and so I started doing that, and by the time I got to Brooklyn, I had about $2.50 worth of change of things people left behind. And it was a quick way of making money when I was 11 years old. So that's my childhood. And so then my name was changed to Murray when I enrolled in school. And the reason it was Murray was because my teacher, they put me in second grade because I couldn't speak English, and my teacher had just gotten married. Her husband's name was Murray. I was enrolled into a religious Jewish school, and the teachers were very severe and real punitive, and I couldn't stand the strictness of it, and I always liked to draw, so one of the teachers, I guess to save his life and mine, let me decorate the walls of the classroom, and I did murals. Starting when I was 11 years old, I would do murals in his class, and then the other teachers liked it, and so they invited me to the other rooms, and I spent 2 years doing murals in elementary school. My father thought I wasn't getting the proper education, but that was better than me getting thrown out of class every day. And then when I was in high school, I took a lot of art courses. But by that time I had taught myself photography. By the time I got into high school, I already knew photography. I was around the corner from where we lived, there was a drugstore, and the druggist saw me riding around on my bicycle, and he asked me to deliver prescriptions to people who couldn't get out. And there was a camera in one of the shelves he let me have, and I came with instructions, and I taught myself how to process film, and so I started taking pictures, and in high school I took pictures for yearbooks and things, and so by the time in high school I started making money doing people's parties and photographing their kids. I originally went to the City College of New York, which is part of the City University system, and with a good enough grade point average, you can go there for free. And I went there, studied engineering, didn't quite work out, went to Pratt Institute for Architecture for a year, and that wasn't the right thing. And I came back to City College and then went through a series of different majors until I realized that the only thing that I was really interested in was art. And so I spent the rest of my college years in the art department. At City College, there were a number of teachers. Actually, the one who encouraged me the most he and I were always at each other's neck. His name was Ralph Fabry. He was a painter. He came from Hungary, and he sort of detected my Eastern European background, so he said himself that he was going to make me into the painter that he thought I should be. And he would ride me very hard and make me do things over again. And he was quite a good painter, and he would make me do paintings so that I would see the principles of light and color. He was a dedicated impressionist, and he wanted everybody who became a painter to understand, if not follow Impressionism, at least to understand all the principles of Impressionism. And actually, at that time, I couldn't stand him, but I kept coming back to his classes. But I realized much later that what he taught me served me so well in photography and in painting, and also understanding all of painting. The notion about light, how light works, how light changes color, how light changes the subject, how it's the moment you look at it, the way you look at it influences everything that you see. Later on, when I went to Cooper Union, there was a man named Charlie Side, who was an extraordinary painter. He then ultimately became dean of the school. But he would sit with you and discuss. He would see the way your mind works, and he would intertwine your mind with what you were doing. I didn't know that he was doing that again until much later, and it's amazing how you wake up decades after it's all going on. And he would sit with me for long periods of time and go through a painting and analyze a painting, and then he would maybe bring in another painting and discuss that one sort of by itself. But I knew that he was trying to teach me principles from that painting to mine, but he would never say, see the way he did it and you ought to do that. But he would show how the artist went through the machinations of his expression, of his thinking, of his art, and how he made his decisions, and he was pretty influential to me. When I went to graduate school at Rhode Island School of Design, and that was Harry Callahan, and he taught by not teaching. We would come to his house once every 2 weeks, and we would show our work. And the other students, of which there were probably 7 most of the time, they might or might not comment on your pictures. And he would at the most say, that's pretty good. At the least he would say, you've been outside photographing, huh? That was it. And for the first 6 months it was infuriating, because you didn't know if you were doing, and what he wanted you to do was to go your own way and he didn't want to encourage you by telling you it's good, and he didn't want to discourage you by telling you it's bad. And it's graduate school, so you're supposed to be on your own. And ultimately, the good students found their own work, found their own voice, and found their own way of doing it. And you sort of more or less read the energy in the room. That's what you did. Again, this is decades later, I realized this, not at that time. I began making pictures that sort of followed a personal impulse of some sort. And I don't know how I got to know to do that, but that's what I did. And the longer I went at doing that, the more I did it, the more it became a personal impulse. So when I come to this point in my life, it's now a gathering of all my experiences, and I'm happy to put in whatever. I feel much more free to incorporate any kind of notion I have that a photograph ought to be. And that was perhaps a lesson that I learned there, that you do it and don't look over your shoulder so much. Even though my first efforts were trying to be a part of what I was seeing around me, as I went on, they became more personal and more my own. And I had the strength to do that, because that's what was encouraged when I was in school, when I was with my teacher. When I draw, or when I've drawn, it's like my mind working quickly, and an awful lot of impulse involved. When I paint, it's much more thoughtful and planned, and especially I used to work in oil. I worked in oil, and you have to plan, because then the canvas gets wet with oil and you can't work anymore. So you do have to have a plan of how you're going to approach that. In color photography, you can be as immediate as you want as in black and white photography. You just see it differently. I always think about it in terms of music. There are certain notes, and I was listening to a composer, and someone asked him why he composed it that way, and he says, you know, there are certain notes that are just beautiful notes, and there are certain notes in combination that when they go together, they just create this harmony that is just magnificent. And I knew exactly what he was talking about, because there are certain tones, when they go with other tones, and they appear in a certain light, that are just by themselves are exquisitely beautiful. And then if you can incorporate those into a photograph, then it's great. Then, and same thing with color. There are certain colors, and maybe different people think of different colors that are that way, but I think of certain colors, and I don't know if I can put a word to them, but there are certain colors that you put together that are just exquisite when they come together. And actually, talking about that, and these days, I have the best of all worlds. A lot of my photography is done right here in the studio. When I get, my time is unpredictable. Sometimes I work real hard, and then comes a period of time when I have no work, and I will turn to my own work. And I think of those colors, I think of those, the way I sketch, and I bring those together and I make a photograph out of it just because I like those colors. And when I'll put it down, it looks just beautiful. It's just a beautiful color. And to show it to somebody else, just that color by itself might not be enough of anything, but it's really a pleasure to look at them. I learned about altering images. There is a very famous photograph by Alfred Eisenstein, and I think everybody knows it, where the World War II just ended, and there's a sailor walking down the street, and he grabs a young lady, and he turns her and he kisses her, and he grabbed that photograph. Well, Life magazine, that picture was originally printed in Life magazine, and I think it was 25 years later or 30 years later, Life magazine decided, maybe 50 years later, 1990, Life magazine decided to find out if that soldier was still alive and if that young lady was still alive, and bring him up, and Alfred Eisenstein was going to photograph him again. Well, there were about 3 dozen soldiers that came forward, and about 4 dozen young ladies that came forward. I mean, 4 dozen, not just 3 or 4, 4 dozen. And they all said, that was me, that's me in the photograph, that's me in there. And so the discussion then started, was this happening all over the place, and did Alfred Eisenstein just catch one of those kissing? Although that kind of seemed a little odd. It wasn't, nobody else caught that on film. Or was it that he had kept asking soldiers to come and do it, and that occurred a number of times? Life magazine bought his contact sheets, and in the contact sheet it only shows it one time, but we don't know what he really did with the other pictures. Well, there was it caused an awful lot of discussion, and the thought was that he set that up. That was a setup. A lot of great photographs are set up. I set them up. I take things that look just like spontaneous like that, and I set them up these days. And I keep photographing it until people lose interest in me, and then I take this great picture, but in the meantime I've set up all the circumstances. Well, one of the people I used to admire a lot was Cartier-Bresson, who took the decisive moment. And I don't think he set up any of his pictures, but he sure would follow the situation until it became just right for him. My thinking then became, well, if people follow these situations, or they sort of set it up, or they might be setting it up, why can't I set up photographs that look real? So I started setting up my photographs. At first with my kids, I did, when my kids were growing up, I wanted to be around them, I wanted them to be around me, but I still wanted to do photography like Harry Callahan did every 2 hours every day. And so I would play with them or let them play, and I would take these pictures, or I would set up circumstances for them to play, and that would be interesting photographs. And so there were a lot of them would be like play acting or theater, and then when they grew up, I started setting up pictures in a different way. And when I came into the studio 15 years ago, and I had this great circumstance here, and I started taking pictures, and they just weren't enough just taking pictures on the street or of people. I would then play with them and make them more. And so I feel free to take photographs and then build on them, and these days draw on them or do what has to be done in order to make it grow into something different. I taught Callahan took a leave of absence my last term there, and he always wanted to teach a beginner's class because he found that that's the only time as an art teacher when you tell someone, when you're critiquing a photograph, a lot of it is arbitrary. It depends on what the teacher says. Well, so he thought, and it's probably true. But when you teach a beginner's class, you say, this is a light meter, and you know that that's true. That's a light meter. You can't argue with that. So he left me all his beginner classes, the first and second term classes. So I took his place for a year. And then I came here to teach to the Memphis College of Art, Memphis Academy of Art at that time. While I was teaching at RISD, Ted Rust called and he found out who the students that were graduating from the photography department were. He wanted to start a department here at the art college. And he called and he went down the list of the graduates. I think there were 4 at that time, and I answered the phone. I said, no, they're not here. He finally came to my name. He says, you want to come and teach in Memphis? And I burst out laughing because I was a radical of the 60s, and Memphis, well, you know about Memphis in the 60s. And he said, well, why don't you just come down and see what it's about? And so I did. When I came in '68, there was nothing having to do with photography, but the background of that was that there was a printmaker who, quite fine and wonderful teacher, Joe Ruffo, and he thought that the school wasn't really complete until it had a photography department. So that put the fire under Ted. Ted then tracked me down and brought me here, not with the idea that I was going to be a department by myself, but I was going to first start at an area of photography. That's what really, and Joe Ruffo had it in mind that we would be a part of his printmaking department. But the interest in photography grew very quickly, and Joe Ruffo had a way of running his printmaking that I didn't think was really going to work well with photography, and so I sort of presented it to the faculty that we ought to be a department of our own, and very quickly laid out a curriculum, and I guess I convinced people, and so within a year or so we were a photography department. We set up also night classes for people who were not enrolled in the school, and the way the department was laid out, we could only have 12 students at a time, Well, as soon as the brochure went out, we had the students. There were 12 students registered within 2 hours, and then Ted Rose started getting phone calls and saying, I'm a contributor, or I'm a special friend of the art college. How come I'm not getting in? And he just told them to call me. And since I was a new guy in town, I could upset everybody, and it was just fine. Well, we used to have one night course, then we became 2 night courses, but we couldn't have any more than that. And for many, many years, we would have students. There was a waiting list of students, and we would just take people and sort of as they came from the waiting list. I was at MCA from 1968 to 1984, about 18 years, with the year off that I took off as sabbatical, and then when I went to Israel, and then I got a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, and I took a year off for that. But I was there for 18 years. During the 60s, late 60s and 70s, and actually into the 80s, we were teaching just black and white. It wasn't until the late 70s that we introduced color, and then in the 80s it became much more color. But learning black and white, you learn all the essentials of photography. You learn about tone, and you learn about space, and you learn about what makes subject matter work. So it's a simple way and a complicated way at the same time. And then you can introduce color, and that adds one more level of complexity. And then we would have additional teachers that would come in and teach various other subjects in photography. We had Richard Reep, who was a fine teacher. He taught alternative processes, and we were making C prints. That's a process that uses a specific kind of chemistry. It was the easiest one for us to do. A lot of the other processes you needed, it was technologically heavy. The school didn't have any money to buy that kind of equipment. The C prints, we just, for $300, you bought this machine that rolled very quickly, and you had to secure the print on the machine, and then made sure that your chemistry was exactly a certain temperature, and after that it was simple. So that was the way that we learned how to do it. The other process that became real popular was Cibachrome, and the process that we did was working from negatives to prints. The advantage of that was simple. The disadvantage of that was that C prints don't have an archival life that's very long. Cibachromes have a longer lifetime. Dye transfer was very complicated and very time consuming, where you had to separate everything into colors. And so I chose not to teach that one, just because I know that students have a short attention span. In your teaching, I think what you wind up doing is you teach whatever it is that you know, except for the basic course when you say, this is a meter, and then you know whatever, and this is an f-stop, and this is the shutter speed, and this is how a camera works, and this is the way you process film. So when you teach that, then it's real simple. But as soon as you get past that, then you get into the areas that begin to be about seeing and being about expression. That's when it gets hard. When you get into those areas, what you do is you're really speaking whatever it is that you're going through. So it's always a good idea, if you're first learning whatever art you're learning, whether it's painting or music or literature or writing, you get that from a lot of different sources, because you're really hearing the way that person finds their expression. So it became simple. So in a way, I thought the best I could do is share my journey, my trip through art with them. and I was always very voracious. So I would teach them about photography, but I also incorporated how paintings work, and sometimes I would bring in music to show see about rhythm, see about tone, see about harmony. Well, see, you've got the same thing in this painting, and you've got the same thing in the photograph, and sometimes they would think I'm cuckoo, and sometimes they'd get it. And when they get it, it just makes your heart flutter. I always was curious about how we really see things, and the appearance of things, and that thread follows through all the work that I do. And so in an elemental way, I would photograph as if the whole idea of the way dreams influence one's real life and the way real life influences dreams. And I didn't necessarily study dreams, but later on I did, but while I was doing that, but just what I thought dreams were all about. And so my photographs were, in a way, having whatever influence our inner psyche has on our being and in our way of seeing, specifically. So the photographs were about that. And simultaneously, I was also discovering how photographs work. Things, what space, for instance, does to a photograph, or what light does to a photograph, or what the tension within the frame does to a photograph. All those things were, so I would photograph with those things in mind, and seeing how that constructs or influences a photograph. And simultaneously, I would also be curious about the ways of seeing. So those were the initial influences. And then, as I became more comfortable with those kind of things, I also began to make it more personal. And so I'd photograph my family, and the moments that I thought were significant, but keeping in mind all those other things having to do with our psyche and our and the way photographs work. So that's how it evolved. Actually, talking about the creative process is real interesting. The way I see it, for me, is it's changed throughout my life. Initially, when I first started photographing seriously, it was I wanted to know what was going on. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to do the things that were important, that all the important photographers were doing. And then I realized that was not being expressive of me. So then I started thinking about how to do it so that how I can find my voice. And then I realized that the best photographers or painters or anybody like that had an individuality, and they followed the thrust of that individuality and made whatever they did through that individuality. And so that's when it became really interesting to me. So I wanted to find out who I was, and so the creative process basically became, for me, to deal with my medium while simultaneously trying to find out what it was that I was, and what I was. What was I thinking? What was I doing? How did this reflect me? And then try to do it in such a way that it wasn't self-conscious, because if you're self-conscious, it's real. It's deadening. So to do it so that it's free and easy. These days, I feel confident, and I know I like a lot of certain things I like in photography, and I start out with those things I like. I like the way color looks. I like the way things look. I like playing with certain elements, and I just start with those, and so it's a pleasing experience to me. I have different periods of my work that I liked. I liked the work I was doing in the 70s, and then it totally changed. I was invited to come and teach in Israel for a year, And my work totally changed then because of the circumstance of the film. I had a lot of time. I taught at the University of Haifa, but they rented me out to different schools and kibbutzim where I could go and lecture or talk. And so I traveled a lot and photographed a lot. And I didn't process any of that film for a whole year. And at the end of the year, I packed up a crate and shipped it back. And then we flew back with our clothing. And the crate was loaded onto a ship. And right after it was loaded onto the ship, they had a dock strike. And so in the middle of August, in the Mediterranean heat, the film sat there for about 3 months or 2 months. And then the ship finally left port, and it took the long route around the Arctic Ocean or something. And so by the time it came to me, that film had probably the worst experience that films could have. So I had to figure out chemically and technically how to resuscitate this film. And this film was, it had, tonally, there were all these tonal changes on it. And when I first started developing the film, it was horrendous, but then I kind of turned it into something that was, I worked with it, and I think it turned into something pretty beautiful. So that was a period that was really wonderful, because I took something that I thought I had lost totally, and I brought it back to life. So in my trip to Israel, I had decided that I was going to leave everything behind except my camera and my film, and I was going to leave the influence on photography to chance. In very simple ways, I would do things like, since I didn't know the country, when I would have, say, a free day, I would say, well, I'm going down to the bus stop, and I knew that there were 4 or 5 different rows of buses, and I would go to the second row from the left, and I would take the 6th bus, and I would stay on it for 2 hours, and at that second hour I'd get off, and wherever that was, that's where I'm going to spend the day photographing. And the most amazing experiences would happen to me every time. Every time I would allow myself to expose myself to chance, the most amazing experience. I would meet up with people who would say, a Druze family, a man, I would get off the bus and start looking around, and a Druze, who are a form of Arabs that are sort of independent, and they're nomads, they roam around. You're here to photograph. And I would say yes, and says, well, come with me, come to my house. And he would feed me, and then his wife would come, and they would show, they just got married, and they had these beautiful dresses hanging that were things from another world, and they would bring out, and then the whole family would show up, and I wound up, and I got there at 10 o'clock, and now it was 6 o'clock in the afternoon, it was time for dinner. We all had to sit down to dinner, and I would be there until midnight. I was thinking, my family probably thought I was kidnapped, and I would never see them again. I wind up at home at 4 o'clock in the morning, and this would happen on and on and on. And so the summer, and also books, I didn't bring any books, and the most amazing books would wind up on my lap. But somebody would just come by and say, here, you need to read this. And I would pick this up, and it was amazing stuff. And so the whole year was sort of an eye-opening experience to chance, and how much things cross our paths. And that has become very elemental in everything I do. I mean, the way I am as a person, or my art, and the way it influenced photography. So it was in a way predictable that my film would get stuck on a boat in the middle of the Mediterranean, and then it would go through the Arctic, and then it would wind up in my lap for me to resuscitate it to life. The interesting part about that event in Israel was that it forced me to, I was always real low tech. I didn't want to get into the technical part of it, because I want the photographic moment was much more interesting to me. But that forced me to get real technical. I had to analyze developers and toners and all that. And so having had learned that and developed that, for a while I stayed with it. And then I started toning my pictures, and by way of that it led into color. So I came back from Israel in '76, and maybe the early '80s I was still doing black and white, and then it slowly began to, while I was toning my pictures, slowly began to change into color. And then I started. Then I had gone through a divorce, and that affected my view of what I was doing, and that changed. And then my art began to be more contemplative, and I started working more with setup situations and things that I could. But all the same ingredients were there, things having to do with light and the unknown and the mystical and whatever that word means. Photography became a way of me sort of spreading my wings in the world, and once I knew that I could do that well, I would try to do different things through it. And when I heard that museums collected photography, this was maybe the year between my 2 years at RISS. My wife and I took a camping trip all across the country. And I thought that what I would do is I would stop at every major museum that we came through and bring in my photographs and ask them to buy some. And that became my goal that year. I thought, you know, what's there to lose? So we went to Cleveland, and then I went there, and they had no time to see me. And I went to the Art Institute of Chicago, and the guy looked at them and, oh, we'd like to buy these 4 photographs. Okay. And then we went on, and we went through Nebraska, and I went, oh, there's a museum here. And do you have a photography curator? No, the print curator's well, can I see him? Yeah, and I'd like to show you my photographs. And he bought some photographs. And so we made it all the way to Colorado, and I think I saw half a dozen museums, and 3 of them bought photographs. And then I came back, and then I sort of reported in class about that, and they thought I had a lot of chutzpah. Do you know what that word means? It's a New York word. It means gall. And I thought, well, you know, I think next time I'm in New York, I was in Rhode Island, and my whole family was in New York, I'm going to go up to the Museum of Modern Art. And so I went up to the Museum of Modern Art and told him I wanted to see the photography curator, and I showed him my portfolio, and he invited me into his office and looked at my pictures and bought 3 of them. And he said, from now on, I want you to come back here every time you have a new portfolio and show me your new work. And I thought that was just absolutely the best. For a long time, I had a great ambition to be in a lot of museums and have a lot of shows. And actually part of why I wanted to be a teacher was because it gave you the opportunity to, I mean, I love teaching, but I also had a lot of time in which to work. And I worked a lot and had a lot of shows and went to a lot of museums and galleries and would sell my stuff. When I first came to Memphis, they had photography exhibit at the Brooks, and it was, the camera club would show, and it was a lot of pictures of flowers and birds. And so I thought I would have an exhibit here in Memphis about what's new in photography all over the country. And I interested the Little Rock Museum, and they would sponsor part of it, and the art college would sponsor part of it. The cost of the exhibit wasn't going to be that much. Nobody was charging us to send us pictures. And I invited all these photographers because I knew them. But shipping and handling and all that, and I wanted a catalog to be printed. So the Little Rock Museum was able to do that, and we paid for the shipping. The photographs, as you can imagine, were of all kinds of variety, and it was the 70s, and there were a bunch of nudes, and someone got offended by the fact that there were nudes hanging in a public institution, and they made a big to-do about it and went to the city council and complained. And the mayor, Mayor Loeb at that time, requested that we take the photographs down, the nudes. And the board convinced Mayor Loeb that it was not a good idea, that the whole world is watching and this is a breach of academic freedom and you don't want to do that. You don't want to look bad before the rest of the country. And so Mayor Loeb said, yeah, maybe you're right. Well, what followed the next day was that somebody came to one of the faculty members' homes and kidnapped their son. Do you remember that? And either the photographs come down or the son gets killed. Well, then we took the photographs down. It was now 3 days before the end of the exhibit. And at that point, we hit the New York Times, the Bombay News in India, the China Herald. I got things sent to me from everywhere about how it, and the detective news made it 2 months later, how all this happened and they still haven't caught the guy. The child was returned. The child was the son of a faculty member from Rhodes. He was a reverend. He taught religion. And he then went on to become a teacher at MUS, the child who got kidnapped. But Mayor Loeb was so offended by this whole thing that someone else was able to force the photographs to come down and he could not, that he then insisted that all the photographs be hung in his office. Bill Thomas, he was the one who wrote the story. He wrote, at that time we used to, you know how we have Parade magazine and the Commercial Appeal? Well, we used to have the Sunday Commercial magazine. And he wrote this long, extensive article on nudes that we use in drawing class. You know, all art schools have nudes. I mean, nobody ever thinks about it. Well, right after the story came out, and I was teaching drawing, and so he interviewed me and says, well, do you use nudes? Yeah, I use nudes. Well, do you find it unusual? Why would I find it unusual? All art schools in the world use nudes. And so we went on and on. It came out on Sunday. The Monday after the article came out, I got a phone call. Actually, my wife got a phone call. I was at the school teaching. We want you to leave Memphis or else we're going to kill you. And she thought it was one of our friends from New York wanting us to come back. And she burst out laughing. She thought it was just the funniest thing, and she hung up. And the guy calls back 20 minutes later and says, that was a serious threat. If you don't leave Memphis, we're going to kill you. And that continued for the rest of the week until I think by Wednesday she got it, that it was serious. And so the police assigned their crack squad to come and sit in on the classes thinking that they might be able to catch the guys. And they wanted to blend in. And so they took their jackets off, and someone told them that they needed pads to draw on. You know, in art school, they have pads that are big. They're 24 by 30, and they all came with pads that you take notes on. And so there they were, in their very polished shoes, their white shirts and black pants with their little pads and their little Sharpie pencils, wanting to blend in. That was terrific. That was a sight. Everybody, all the teachers went by just to stare at our police. So all that added to this aura of the South. There was something really curious about the South. So we were able to, with the help of Jameson Jones, who was the director after Ted Rust at the Art College, and his grant writing expertise, we were able to get some grants and developed this exhibit called Southern Eye, Southern Mind. And we had 10 exhibits on at the same time in the city of Memphis. And it was pretty terrific. There were exhibits that were historical, contemporary, some that were juried, some that were invited, some that were, and everyone picked an aspect of a different aspect of photography, and were able to see in what ways photography was or was not influential. And then we had a symposium. We invited a number of historians and critics to come here to Memphis and talk about it. Well, there was a thread that came through that was going on in photography that came out of the South. There was something slightly Baroque or a little bit quirky, or like the photographs, say, in modern times of Bill Eggleston or Emmett Gowan or Sally Mann, and then the photographs of earlier times when Walker Evans came through here with James Agee, and then I would watch people that I knew well, Jim Dow or John McWilliams, and they took photographs, and they were always there was a little bit something quirky and odd about it. And I thought that was strange that that kind of photography didn't come from the Northeast. The Northeast had its own bizarreness to it, and the Northwest had all this beautiful landscape, but the South had this look that was slightly William Faulknerish in a way, and it was not a coincidence that William Faulkner came from the South. That was that kind of atmosphere, and it permeated through photography. I had a show at the Photographers Gallery in London, and it was a one-man show, but I didn't have, at that time, the money to fly for the opening. So a friend of mine was going through there at that time, and he went there in my stead. He posed as me. He said he could answer all my questions probably better than I could. So, and he was much more charming, and he said he charmed a whole bunch of girls. I think I did great by letting him go. I always wanted to really, really enjoy what I did. The only thing that would not be enjoyable is if I had a show coming up and I had a deadline. So that's why I don't, if I can stay away from deadlines, I'm great. That's my creative process. When I was doing those shows, it was a way, artists do work, and then they want to show, and then they want to sell, and I guess these days what I think of is it was all a part of me getting to know what art is all about, or what I'm all about, and it was real nice at that time. I needed all that recognition, I guess, and then I went through that, and I remember this consciously, and I thought, oh, so that's what this is all about. And at that point, after that, none of that was important anymore. And so then I stopped getting interested in shows. And I don't know when it happened, but after that, I would have like one show every 3 years, and now it's every 6 years. And I just like making my photographs a lot, and if a show comes up, it's fine. If not, that's even better.